There can be many influential people in your life, but most of the time one person comes to mind. While being a student, I have had many teachers. There have been some that I've really liked, but one teacher has really made an impact on my life. Everyone has had a teacher who brings out the best in them. Right now, I would like to pay tribute to my 7th grade math teacher, Mrs. Cronin. Mrs. Cronin is the best example of outgoing, kind, and diligent, which she has shown day in and day out at JMS. Mrs. Cronin is extremely outgoing, and she is a great leader. For example, she sings songs in front of the whole class, so all of her students will do well on the test. Mrs. Cronin was being outgoing when she started cheerleading in front of the class, again to help her students memorize difficult material. As a student, her cheers and songs helped me remember everything on the test. But more importantly, she taught me to be comfortable in my own skin. Mrs. Cronin is also a very diligent worker. One class, all the students were not focusing, so she decided to tell us we were having a test soon and that we would have to study. But most of the students in the class didn't understand the subject, so she spent the class helping us prepare so we didn't fail. I was still having trouble with the math, and so were a couple of other students. Mrs. Cronin told us to stay after school. All the students who needed help did stay, and she helped us on the chapter all afternoon. This is proof that Mrs. Cronin is the most diligent teacher at JMS. Mrs. Cronin is also very kind. She always wants the best for her students. When we were studying the area of triangles and other shapes, she made another study guide for us because the other one was too confusing for the class. Even though the study guide probably took her all afternoon to create, Mrs. Cronin wanted us to do well on the test. She was kind enough to take time out of her day and make another study guide. Another example of Mrs. Cronin's kindness was when she helped me on one of the projects we had to do. I had been out sick for 2 days, and Mrs. Cronin told me that the project was due the next day. After the class was over, I told Mrs. Cronin there was no way my poster would be done by tomorrow. She told me that the next day she would help me finish it. Mrs. Cronin helped me finish my project with confidence, knowing that I did my best. This was very kind of Mrs. Cronin to help me work on my poster. These are just 2 examples of how Mrs. Cronin is kind. I know that everyone has a favorite teacher. I just hope that you can see how special Mrs. Cronin is. Because she is outgoing, kind, and diligent, she always brings out the best in her students. The impact Mrs. Cronin has had on my life is amazing. In my eyes, Mrs. Cronin will forever be one of the best teachers. Mrs. Cronin is truly a beautiful person inside and out. I could not have asked for a better math teacher. I hope other students learn not only math from Mrs. Cronin, but to always be true to yourself, just like I did.